What you're about to hear was not created by chance. Every word of tonight's story was shaped through hours of careful research and patient, focused work. Each detail was chosen deliberately to provide a calm, immersive listening experience while staying true to the events as they actually happened. This channel exists for one reason: to cast a steady light on the stories that time almost allowed to fade away. Before the jazz faded from the French Quarter air, before the last beads of Mardi Gras hit the pavement, something was moving through the dark corridors of New Orleans, not as a man, not as a monster men could name, but as a hunger that wore a human face, drove a dark car through familiar streets, and vanished into the Louisiana night like smoke swallowed by black water. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. This evening, we uncover 3 disturbing cases where the truth lurked far beneath a harmless surface. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the Phantom of the Bayou, the Storyville Slayer, aka the Canal Strangler, the Ghost of the Red Light. New Orleans had a soul. Something was hunting it. Now let's begin. Picture a city that breathes like a living thing, where the Mississippi rolls slow and heavy past rusted iron balconies, where the music from a dozen open doorways bleeds together into something sacred, where the fog-off Lake Pontchartrain settles low over the bayou roads like a burial shroud pulled gently across sleeping ground. New Orleans has always been beautiful the way a dangerous thing is beautiful. All color and candlelight and the smell of something sweet rotting just beneath the surface. But in the early 1990s, something far worse than decay was moving through the streets of the Crescent City. One by one, then 2 by 2, then body after body after body. Women were vanishing from the corners of Algiers and the back blocks of Treme, from the shadow-soaked stretches of highway that stitched the city's outskirts together, only to be discovered days, weeks, sometimes months later, face down in canal water the color of rust, half consumed by the earth that the killer had chosen as their grave. By the time anyone fully understood what was happening, more than 24 people were dead, and the man or men responsible had never truly been caught. What you are about to hear is not a ghost story, though it carries the chill of one. It is a true account of one of the most disturbing and still unresolved serial killing sprees in American history. A case that exposed corruption, shattered public trust, and left an entire city looking over its shoulder. This is the story of the Storyville Slayer, also known as the Canal Strangler, also whispered about in the darkest corners of Louisiana cold case forums as the Ghost of the Red Light, and the trail of the dead that he left scattered across the waterways of New Orleans like stones dropped into black water, sinking without a sound. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. New Orleans has never been an easy city to understand from the outside. It is a place that wears its contradictions with a kind of reckless grace. Poverty and opulence pressed together on the same street, the sacred and the profane trading places every few blocks, history layered so thick beneath the sidewalks that you can feel the weight of it when you walk. The neighborhood of Storyville, which once served as the city's legally designated red light district, a stretch of streets where brothels operated openly and jazz music was born in the parlors between transactions, had long been demolished by the time the 1990s arrived. The Navy had seen to that decades earlier, bulldozing the whole quarter and raising a housing project over its bones. But the trade that had defined Storyville never truly disappeared. It scattered, as forbidden things always do, into the surrounding streets, into Algiers on the west bank of the Mississippi, into the music-soaked alleyways of Treme, into the dark stretches of road that ran alongside the highway corridors where nobody much paid attention to who stopped and who didn't. It was into this world, this particular geography of vulnerability, that a killer arrived, or perhaps killers. That ambiguity would haunt this case from its very beginning to its still-open conclusion. And it is part of what makes the Storyville Slayer one of the most unsettling figures in American true crime history. Not a man fully caught, not a mystery fully solved. Just a shadow that moved through a city and left its mark in blood and water and decomposed remains, and then faded into the population as though it had never existed. The first sign that something was wrong came in July of 1991, when a young woman who would later be known only as Brenda, her real name withheld from public record to protect what little safety she had left, climbed into the car of a man she did not know on a street in Algiers. This was not an unusual act in her world. It was survival. The man was well-dressed. He was muscular, clean-cut, somewhere in his middle 30s. He drove a dark-colored car, possibly a Buick Regal or a Chevrolet Monte Carlo. A car that looked respectable, that looked like it belonged to someone who had no reason to harm anyone. He spoke to her. He seemed ordinary. And then, when the car had moved far enough from anywhere that anyone would hear her, he reached across and closed his hands around her throat. He did not use a weapon. He did not need one. His hands were enough. He squeezed and squeezed until the world went dark for her, and when she woke she was lying in a ditch, covered with garbage and discarded tires, her clothes gone, her body scraped and bruised, the early Louisiana morning pressing down on her like something wet and heavy. She had been stripped, strangled into unconsciousness, dumped, and left for dead. That she survived it all was, by every measure, a miracle. A thread of biological stubbornness that kept her heart beating when everything else had failed. She did not go to the police immediately. Women in her position rarely did in that city in that era. But eventually she told her story, and from her description, detectives would construct a composite sketch, a careful pencil portrait of a muscular, well-dressed, middle-aged black man who drove a dark vehicle and strangled with his bare hands. It was a sketch that would become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire investigation, though nobody would understand that for years. 3 weeks after Brenda was left for dead in that ditch, a 17-year-old girl named Danielle Britton was found in a ditch of her own, not far from where Brenda had been attacked. Danielle was not breathing. She never would breathe again. She had been beaten and strangled, her body covered with garbage as though whoever had disposed of her wanted the earth to swallow her before anyone noticed she was gone. She had dropped out of school shortly before her death. She had been seen at a bar called Neva's Rendezvous with a man matching the description that Brenda would later give to investigators. Muscular, well-dressed, a dark car at the curb. Danielle was 17 years old. She was the first confirmed victim of whatever was moving through the streets of New Orleans. She would not be the last. September brought another body. 28-year-old Charlene Price was found in a city park, less than a mile from where Danielle had been discovered, beaten and strangled in the same methodical way. And then November delivered 37-year-old Regina Oko, a mother of 3, discovered strangled, her body containing a heavy dose of cocaine that may or may not have been administered by someone else before her death. Regina had children at home who would wait for her and never see her walk through the door again. In December, skeletal remains were pulled from a ditch near a highway. An unidentified young black woman, approximately 20 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, with noticeably protruding front teeth. She has never been named. She has never been claimed. She remains, to this day, a Jane Doe in a case file, a set of measurements without a mother's name attached to them. The killings in 1991 alone, Danielle, Charlene, Regina, and the unnamed woman in the ditch, shared a signature that investigators would eventually recognize as a pattern, though at this stage the connections were not yet being drawn with any urgency. The victims were largely women of color, many of them living precarious lives at the margins of the city's economy. Women involved in survival sex work, women with drug histories, women whose disappearances did not generate the same institutional urgency as those of women in more protected circumstances. This is one of the most disturbing dimensions of the Storyville Slayer case. Not just that a predator moved freely through New Orleans for years, but that the conditions which allowed him to do so were structural, embedded in the way the city's institutions decided whose deaths demanded immediate attention and whose could wait. By the time 1992 arrived, the killer had not stopped. He had accelerated. In January, 29-year-old Lydia Madison was found dead. In June, 25-year-old George Williams, a transgender woman who had worked as an exotic dancer at a New Orleans nightclub, was discovered in the LaBranche wetlands of St. Charles Parish, strangled. In July, the body of Noah Filson, an exotic dancer who performed under the stage name Brenda Bewitch, was found floating naked in a canal beside Interstate 55, north of Laplace. In September, 29-year-old Regator Martin, a mother of 3 who had been surviving through sex work, was pulled from the waters of another canal near a highway. She had been strangled. She had children at home. Each of these women, each of these people had a life, had mornings, had names that someone somewhere still whispered in grief. The killer chose them not because they were invisible to him, but because he understood, with the cold intelligence of a predator, that they were invisible to the systems that might have protected them. He moved among them with an ease that spoke of familiarity. He knew their world. He knew their streets. He knew the dark patches of highway where a car could stop and not be seen by anyone who mattered. It was in October 1992, after a police sketch of the suspect had been released to the media, based on Brenda's testimony, that something strange happened. The killings stopped. For 5 months, the bodies ceased appearing. The city exhaled, cautiously. Had he left? Had he been frightened off by the publicity? Had he looked at that pencil drawing in the newspaper and seen something too close to his own face staring back? Nobody knew. But in the silence that followed, the investigators who had quietly begun connecting these deaths had a moment to look at what they had. And what they had was terrifying. A growing list of victims, a partial sketch, and a killer who had been operating in the open for over a year without any serious institutional response. Then, as 1993 began, the bodies returned. In February, the skeletal remains of 30-year-old Cheryl Lewis were discovered in the waters of a canal near Hahnville. Cheryl had vanished from the streets of the city months earlier. By the time she was found, the water and time had done their work, stripping her down to something that investigators could barely identify. But identify her they did, and Cheryl Lewis, along with a handful of other victims found in the same period, would eventually become the thread that led investigators to one of their 2 key suspects. There is a particular geography to the Storyville Slayers' killing ground that becomes more chilling the longer you study it. The victims were not found scattered randomly across the city. They clustered, with grim consistency, along the highway corridors that run along the western shores of Lake Pontchartrain. Interstate 10, Interstate 55, Interstate 310. These were the arterial roads of the region, the fast-moving routes that connected New Orleans to its surrounding parishes, that cut through stretches of bayou and scrubland where a car could pull off the road in the dark and the nearest witness might be miles away. The killer knew these roads. He knew which canal banks were accessible and which were not. He knew how long a body could lie in dark water before the current moved it somewhere visible. He knew that the Louisiana wetlands were extraordinarily efficient at consuming evidence, that the heat, the water, the insects, and the microorganisms would collaborate in the destruction of anything that might link a corpse to its killer. This knowledge was not accidental. It spoke of a man who had spent time in this landscape, who had driven these roads at night and made calculations, who understood exactly how long his violence would remain hidden. In 1993 and 1994, the pace of the killings intensified to a degree that should have sent every law enforcement agency in the region into full emergency mode. Victim after victim was surfacing from the waterways. 42-year-old Dolores Mack, a Jane Doe of unknown age, another Jane Doe between 15 and 17 years old, a teenager barely older than Danielle Britton had been, 25-year-old Stephanie Murray. More Jane Does, women the system could not name, women whose identities had been erased not just by death but by the circumstances of their lives. 32-year-old Michelle Foster, 28-year-old Stephanie Brown, 29-year-old Wanda Ford, 39-year-old Sandra Warner, 24-year-old Henry Calvin. More unidentified remains. 30-year-old Karen Ivester, 28-year-old Sharon Robinson. These names, these ages. Say them slowly and let the arithmetic do its quiet, dreadful work. Dozens of individual human beings. Individuals with specific faces, specific voices, specific people who loved them, had been taken from the streets of New Orleans and deposited into the waterways and ditches of the surrounding parishes. And for the better part of 4 years, the institutional response had been fragmented, slow, and largely invisible to the public. The method of the killings was consistent enough to suggest a single hand, yet varied enough to create confusion. The majority of the victims had been strangled, a deliberate, intimate, controlled method of killing that requires physical closeness and sustained effort. It is not a frenzied act. It is a purposeful one. It requires the killer to look at their victim, to maintain eye contact with them, or to watch their face as the life departs. This is not the act of someone who is detached from their violence. It is the act of someone who is fully, consciously present in it. Some victims showed signs of having been beaten before death. Some had been drowned, their killers apparently willing to vary the execution while maintaining the fundamental approach. Get the victim into a vehicle, get them to a remote location, and end their life with the body's most direct available tools. The disposal sites were chosen with a predator's calculation. Bodies were lowered into canals under the cover of darkness, or dragged to the edges of bayou banks and rolled in, or simply dumped along the shoulders of elevated highway stretches where the land below was all water and reeds. The isolation of these sites meant that weeks or months often passed before a body was discovered. And by that time, the evidence of cause, manner, and time of death had been partially or entirely consumed by the environment. DNA collection was in its relative infancy as an investigative tool during the early 1990s, and the decomposition of remains in Louisiana's aggressive subtropical climate made even basic identification an enormous challenge. Several victims were never identified at all. They are still, decades later, listed in case files as Jane Doe and John Doe. Not names, just placeholders for lives that the system could not restore to their full humanity. It was in 1994 that the first genuine lead attached itself to a specific man. Russell Elwood, a drifter in his late 40s, a man who had arrived in New Orleans from Ohio in 1968 and spent the following 3 decades building a life that amounted to very little except a long history of drug addiction and petty criminal behavior, was found by police parked on a road near the sites where 2 victims' bodies had previously been recovered. The circumstances of his being found there were disturbing enough on their own. He was partially undressed in his car. The excuse he offered for his presence did not match the tools he had with him. He was noted, flagged, and allowed to leave. But his name went into a file, and in the world of serial killer investigations, a name in a file has a habit of returning. Elwood worked intermittently as a taxi driver and a photographer, 2 professions that gave him legitimate reasons to be on the streets at any hour, in any neighborhood, picking up strangers and transporting them through the city's dark geography. He was a heroin user, a crack cocaine user, someone whose entire social world revolved around the street-level drug economy that overlapped significantly with the sex work community where most of the victims had lived. He knew these women not as abstractions but as people he encountered regularly, people whose vulnerability he understood and whose circumstances made them accessible in ways that the killer needed his victims to be. He would later, while imprisoned on unrelated charges in a different state, begin to talk. And when Elwood talked, what came out was not the vague boasting of a man seeking notoriety. What came out were specifics. He described in graphic and clinical detail how he had drugged women, injecting them with a lethal cocktail of narcotics that left them helpless and barely conscious, and had then assaulted them sexually before dragging their bodies to the water. He told an investigator that he had taken a black woman and placed her in the water. He told his ex-girlfriend things that no innocent man would know. He took her, on at least one occasion, to view the bodies of 2 of his victims. A detail so extraordinary and so cold-blooded that it requires a moment to fully absorb. He brought someone to see the dead. He stood at the edge of a canal or a ditch and showed a person the work he had done, as though it were something to be witnessed. Several women who had survived encounters with Elwood came forward to testify. Diane Gilliam, Navassa Richmond, Janie Stokes, Antoinette Rainey. They described a man who preyed on women through the common currency of drug addiction, offering narcotics as payment, using the debilitating effects of those narcotics to render his victims incapable of resistance, and then doing what he intended to do from the beginning. Antoinette testified that he had not only violently attacked her, but had raped her. These were not allegations without substance. These were the testimonies of women who had been there, who had felt his hands, who had survived something that had killed others. The task force investigators, who were now working the case with increasing urgency, began building a timeline. Elwood's movements aligned with the emergence of multiple victims. Apparently, a compulsive record-keeping practice provided an alibi architecture that investigators began to dismantle piece by piece. The receipts he produced to account for his whereabouts during the relevant time periods were, at crucial junctures, incomplete. The gaps in the documentation aligned with unnerving consistency with the time windows in which victims had last been seen alive. But Elwood was not the only figure in the frame. Alongside him, operating in an entirely different social register, in a different part of the city's world, another suspect had appeared, and this suspect wore a badge. On August 12, 1995, the chief of police of New Orleans, Richard Pennington, stood before the cameras and the reporters and the stunned assembly of the city's press corps and announced two things that, taken together, created a kind of civic earthquake. First, he confirmed what many people in the affected communities had already understood in their bones. A serial killer was actively stalking New Orleans and had been responsible for at least 24 murders. Second, he revealed that the primary suspect in two of those murders was a member of his own police force, Victor Gant, Officer Victor Gant, a New Orleans Police Department officer who had been on the force since 1980, who had spent years patrolling the red light districts where many of the victims had lived and worked, who had built an extensive network of contacts among pimps, sex workers, and street-level drug informants, and who had, in the early 1990s, developed a reputation for being considerably more than merely acquainted with the criminal underworld he was ostensibly paid to police. The details that had led investigators to Gant's door were a combination of physical evidence, personal history, and the kind of circumstantial accumulation that builds quietly around a guilty person until the weight of it becomes impossible to ignore. Physically, Gant was a striking match for the composite sketch that Brenda had helped create in 1991. He was muscular, a former boxer who had continued to work out obsessively throughout his adult life. He was in his early 30s at the time of the initial murders. He was, by all accounts, well-dressed and clean-cut, exactly the kind of man who could slide a dark car up to a curb in Algiers and present himself as safe, as ordinary, as someone a woman might reasonably climb in beside. He had grown up in Algiers himself. He knew every street, every ditch, every canal bank in the neighborhood where Brenda had been attacked and where Danielle Britton had been found. He knew this geography the way a predator knows its territory, not as a stranger passing through, but as a native who had mapped it long ago. The connection to Sharon Robinson was the most explosive element of the case against him. Sharon was 28 years old and worked as a coin changer at a New Orleans casino. She was Gant's former girlfriend, his former roommate, a woman who had, in December of 1994, gone to the police to report that Gant had beaten her. She had told officers, in a formal statement, that he had punched her in the face and broken her nose. He denied it. He said it was an argument, that she had fallen and hit her nose on a piece of furniture. Her children, who had been present, contradicted his version of events entirely. The complaint was logged. A disciplinary process was initiated. And then, in April 1995, Sharon Robinson was found face down in shallow water in Laplace, Louisiana. Police theorized that whoever killed her had stood behind her and held her head beneath the surface until she stopped fighting. Karen Ivester, Sharon's friend, a woman who fit the profile of the Storyville Slayer's other victims far more precisely than Sharon did, was found dead on the same night. A shoe print tread discovered beside Karen's body matched the shoe that Sharon was wearing when she died, suggesting that the two women had been murdered in the same location by the same person, and then moved. Investigators noted the timing with cold precision. Sharon was set to testify at Gant's departmental disciplinary hearing. She was the complainant in the domestic violence case against him, and now she was dead. Gant was brought in for formal interview in May 1995. He denied everything. He denied being in a relationship with Sharon Robinson. He denied any knowledge of either woman's death. These denials were contradicted not just by Sharon's family and friends, but by the physical and circumstantial evidence that investigators were assembling. The St. John the Baptist Parish Sheriff's Office obtained a warrant for Gant's DNA, head hair, pubic hair, and saliva. The results, when they came, were inconclusive. Not exculpatory. Inconclusive. The testing technology of 1995 was not what it would later become, and the ambiguity of the result meant that Gant remained in a liminal investigative space. Neither cleared nor charged, suspected but not proven. Other women came forward to describe patterns of behavior by Gant that were, at minimum, deeply alarming. He had a documented history of violence toward women he was intimate with. A subsequent girlfriend, Karen Thibodeau, filed a battery complaint against him in November of 1996, alleging that he had choked and threatened her. A remarkably specific form of violence to allege against a man suspected of choking and drowning women in the waterways of his home city. Thibodeau later withdrew the complaint under circumstances that were never fully explained. A pattern was visible, and the pattern was not subtle. Women who crossed Victor Gant, who challenged him, who threatened his position or his freedom, had a troubling tendency to encounter violence. The revelation that a police officer was a suspect in the city's most sensational serial killing investigation sent shockwaves through New Orleans. The department, Gant himself had been the subject of racketeering allegations, accused of running criminal operations against the very pimps and street criminals he was supposed to be policing. His access to the world where the victims lived and died was not incidental. It was professional. He had badge and gun and authority and a face that the women of those neighborhoods knew. A well-dressed man with a dark car who knew your name, who perhaps had given you information or taken information from you, or made you feel for just a moment that the uniform meant safety, was uniquely positioned to make the approach that ended in strangulation and dark water. Meanwhile, as the investigation spread across 2 suspects and multiple jurisdictions, the task force that had been assembled to catch the killer was developing its own internal problems. The leader of that task force, a figure whose conduct would later come under serious scrutiny, was accused of destroying evidence. A deputy within the investigation who had reported this alleged destruction of materials was fired, a termination they would later attempt to contest in court. The polygrapher called in to examine the task force leader produced results that were, in certain key areas involving the evidence receipts, deeply troubling. The entire investigative apparatus, the machinery built specifically to bring justice to the dead, was showing signs of rot from the inside. And through all of this, the bodies had stopped appearing. The killings, for all practical purposes, ceased in 1995 and 1996. Whether this was because both suspects had been named publicly and had retreated in self-preservation, whether one or both had left the city, or whether the answer lay in some third explanation that investigators had not yet found, nobody could say with certainty. In August of 1997, a call came in to a national radio program. A man who identified himself only as Clay spoke live on air and described, with a specificity that the FBI would find deeply credible, how he had killed 12 women in New Orleans. He talked about the methods. He talked about the locations. He mentioned details that investigators confirmed had never been released to the public. The kinds of details that exist only in crime scene reports and the private knowledge of the person who was there. The FBI responded by going to the studio and seizing the audio recording. Investigators noted that Russell Elwood had been incarcerated at the time of the call, which either cleared him of being Clay or raised the possibility that the call itself was from a second, unidentified killer who had operated alongside Elwood during the same period. Clay mentioned that he had not killed in nearly a year. He mentioned that his victims reminded him, in some way, of people he knew. He mentioned, in passing, that no one had noticed his signature, that he had wanted to be recognized and had been disappointed that no recognition came. He never called again. In 1998, Russell Elwood stood trial for the murders of Cheryl Lewis and Dolores Mack. The prosecution's case was built on the testimony of the women who had survived him, on the jailhouse statements he had made with unsettling specificity, on the witnesses who placed him with Cheryl Lewis in the period before her death, and on the devastating detail that his ex-girlfriend had provided, that he had brought her to 2 of his victims, that she had stood beside him at the edge of whatever waterway held whatever he had put there, and that this was something that had happened. There is no innocent interpretation of that act. There is no version of taking a person to view a body in which the person showing the way is not the person responsible. The defense attacked every pillar of the prosecution's structure. Elwood's attorney argued that the case was built on the words of jailhouse informants, a category of witness that has historically proven unreliable, and on the testimony of women who had their own complex relationships with law enforcement and with Elwood himself. The physical forensic evidence was limited, eroded by time and water and the particular cruelty of a Louisiana climate that consumed what a murderer had left behind. The logs that Elwood kept, his compulsive personal record of his daily whereabouts, were presented as evidence of a man who had nothing to hide. The prosecution's response was that the logs were incomplete at precisely the moments that mattered, that the gaps were not coincidental oversights but deliberate absences. The jury deliberated, and then it convicted. In 1999, Russell Elwood was found guilty of the second-degree murders of Cheryl Lewis and Dolores Mack, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He maintained his innocence. He continued, from his cell at Angola State Prison in Louisiana, to deny that he had done what the jury had concluded he had done. He filed appeals. The Louisiana Court of Appeals reviewed the case in February of 2001, and the conviction stood. He remained incarcerated, still maintaining his denial, until his death at Angola in 2014. He died in prison with the question of whether he had killed 2 women or 26 still officially unanswered. Victor Gant's story moved along a different and equally troubling trajectory. After being named publicly as a suspect in the Robinson and Ivester murders in August of 1995, he continued to work at his desk job within the NOPD for months before the department finally moved to terminate him in 1996. He was found guilty of 4 departmental violations, conduct unbecoming an officer, among other infractions, and was dismissed from the force. But this dismissal did not hold. Gant appealed his firing to the Civil Service Commission, which ruled that the termination had been too severe a punishment, and ordered his reinstatement to the force. The outcry that followed was significant. An appeals court later overturned the commission's ruling, agreeing that Gant should not have been allowed to return to law enforcement under any circumstances. He was again removed from the force. But the story of Victor Gant and law enforcement did not end there. In a development that would have been extraordinary in any context but seemed almost surreal in this one, Gant subsequently found employment as an auxiliary police officer at Carver College in Georgia. When the Huffington Post made contact with the college in 2016 while reinvestigating the case, the institution's president declined to discuss the matter in any meaningful way. Gant himself could not be reached for comment. As of the most recently available information, he remains alive, living in Atlanta, Georgia, still named as a person of interest by the investigators who have never closed their files on the Robinson and Ivester murders. The task force established in 1995 to investigate the killings was disbanded in 1999 without having solved the broader case. The 26 murders, the full, terrible accounting of everything found in those bayous and canals and ditches, remained open. The majority of them remain open to this day. What investigators were left with in the aftermath of the trial and the task force disbandment was a constellation of disturbing possibilities. The most widely held view among the detectives who worked the case is that there may have been 2 killers operating simultaneously in New Orleans during the early 1990s. That the Storyville Slayer may not have been a single entity at all, but a convergence of 2 predators who, by terrible coincidence or by some dynamic of the city's particular criminal ecosystem, hunted the same population of women and disposed of them in the same waterways at roughly the same time. This theory explains some of the inconsistencies in victim profile and method, why some murders feel so clearly like the work of one hand while others carry a slightly different signature, why the sketch that Brenda helped create matches Gant's physical description so precisely while the confessional detail that Elwood provided in prison was so specifically convincing. One piece of physical evidence continued to haunt investigators as the years passed and the technology available to them advanced. At the scene near Sharon Robinson's body, police had recovered a wad of chewing tobacco, a small, organic object that in 1995 had been submitted for DNA analysis and returned inconclusive results. By 2016, when the Huffington Post investigation brought the case back into public consciousness, investigators were hoping that advances in genetic genealogy, the same discipline that would later solve the Golden State Killer case and dozens of other decades-old mysteries, might finally yield something from that tobacco. Whether that testing ever produced a usable result has not been publicly confirmed as of the time of this narration. The investigation officially remains open. In the years since the task force disbanded, the families of the victims have lived with a particular kind of grief, the kind that does not resolve itself, that does not move toward acceptance because acceptance requires some form of closure and closure requires answers. The mother of Danielle Britton, who was 17 years old when she was beaten and strangled and covered with garbage in a ditch in Algiers, has spoken about what it means to carry that loss without ever knowing who carried it to you. The families of the unnamed Jane Does, the young women whose bones were pulled from the water without any identification attached to them, grieve in a way that is even more cruel, because they do not know that there is anything to grieve. Somewhere, someone is still wondering where their daughter or sister went. Somewhere, a family has constructed a story about a woman who simply left, who chose not to come back, who is probably fine somewhere, and that story is the only protection they have from a truth that the system never delivered to them. The woman known only as Brenda, the survivor, the one whose voice started everything, went on to live in fear. Long after the investigation had formally concluded in its partial, unsatisfying way, she remained afraid to go anywhere unaccompanied. She kept her doors locked. She did not walk the streets of Algiers alone. She understood, with the animal certainty of someone who has felt a man's hands close around her throat in the dark, that the person who had done that to her had never been fully stopped. He had been named, perhaps. He had been suspected, perhaps. But he had not been convicted of what he had done to her. He had not stood in a courtroom and answered for the moment he chose to drive her past her destination into the dark. As of this narration, all but one of the murders connected to the Storyville Slayer remain officially unsolved. One conviction, Elwood, for Lewis and Mack stands in the record. One man, Gant, remains a person of interest who has never been charged. A mysterious caller named Clay, whose identity was never established, told a national radio audience that he killed 12 women and wanted to be remembered, and then vanished back into the silence of whoever or whatever he was. And somewhere in New Orleans or Atlanta, or wherever the living have carried themselves since the early 1990s, the full truth of what happened in those bayous and canals remains locked inside a person or persons who have not, in more than 3 decades, offered it up. The Crescent City has many ghosts. Most of them are metaphorical. But the dead of the Storyville case are not metaphor. They are Danielle Britton, 17. They are Charlene Price, 28. They are Regina Oko, 37, mother of 3. They are George Williams and Noah Filson, whose identities were complex and whose deaths were brutal and whose names deserve to be spoken without apology. They are Karen Ivester and Sharon Robinson, dead on the same night by what investigators believe was the same hand. They are the unnamed, the Jane Does, the unidentified remains that the Louisiana water kept until there was nothing left to identify. They are real. They were alive. They mattered before someone decided they didn't. And the man or men who made that decision has never fully answered for it. New Orleans breathes like a living thing. The music still rises from the French Quarter doorways. The Mississippi rolls heavy and slow past the iron balconies. The fog still comes in off the lake on certain nights and settles low over the highway corridors where the bodies were found, where the canal banks hold their silence, where the reeds grow thick and dark and indifferent at the edge of everything the city has not been able to bring itself to fully look at. The Storyville Slayer is still out there. In the record, in the files, in the grief of the families, in the living fear of the one woman who woke up covered in garbage and survived. Still out there in the unsolved columns of the case reports. Still out there in the night geography of a city that learned too late to look down. And somewhere in that city, or somewhere far from it, whoever knew the whole truth took it with them into a life that justice never interrupted. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe, so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Where the Woods Keep Secrets. The Suitland Murders, aka the Bradbury Park Butcher. Maryland, Washington, D.C., October 1986 to January 1987. 5 confirmed victims. 1 unanswered question. He did not announce himself. He did not leave a note, a signature, or a single shred of remorse. He simply moved through the dark edge of a suburb that sat between two worlds, and he made certain that the women he chose would never be found until the earth itself could no longer hold them down. Between October 1986 and January 1987, in the shadow of the nation's capital, within whispering distance of the very institutions built to protect American lives, 5 young women vanished one by one from the streets of Suitland, Maryland, and were later discovered in various states of horrifying decay, discarded in a wooded stretch of land near a park that children used for play. Each of them had been sexually violated. Each of them bore the wounds of a blade. Each of them had simply stepped outside for something ordinary: a pack of cigarettes, a birthday party, a visit with a friend, and had walked directly into the waiting grip of a predator so careful, so deliberate, and so utterly invisible that investigators, even with a task force of 25 officers, could not find him. The killings stopped, but the case was never truly solved. And somewhere out there, the man who turned that woodland into a graveyard has never answered for a single one of them. There is a particular kind of cruelty in choosing the ordinary as your hunting ground. Not a remote highway stretching into the emptiness of somewhere no one visits. Not an abandoned industrial yard on the outskirts of a forgotten town. The killer who descended upon Suitland, Maryland, in the autumn of 1986 chose something far more disturbing. The kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's names, where children rode bicycles on weekday afternoons, where apartment complexes buzzed with the low and constant hum of working-class life. He chose the familiar. He chose the predictable. And he chose it precisely because his victims would not expect danger there. Because danger in that world was supposed to announce itself. It was supposed to come from somewhere else. It was not supposed to live next door. Suitland sits in Prince George's County, technically unincorporated, a breath away from the southeastern edge of Washington, D.C. It is the kind of place that exists in the long shadow of a great city. Not glamorous enough to attract much attention, not rural enough to feel isolated, but caught permanently in that gray in-between space where resources are thin, where police presence is stretched across too many calls and too few officers, and where the institutions that are supposed to serve the community have, over generations, developed a complicated and often adversarial relationship with the people living inside it. In the mid-1980s, like much of the greater D.C. metro area, Suitland was gripped by the twin crises of entrenched poverty and the crack cocaine epidemic that was decimating black communities across the country with a speed and totality that the government seemed in no particular hurry to address. People were struggling. They were surviving by the narrowest of margins. And that survival sometimes meant moving through streets after dark, trusting that the neighborhood, their neighborhood, the place they had built their lives inside, was still safe enough to move through without fear. It wasn't. Not anymore. Not that autumn. The killer, if it was indeed a single individual, which investigators eventually came to believe with a high degree of certainty, moved with extraordinary patience. He did not rush. He did not take victims in rapid succession in ways that would immediately trigger widespread public panic and draw a sudden flood of investigative resources. He seems to have observed, selected, and waited. Chosen the moment, chosen the woman, then acted. The women he chose shared a remarkably consistent physical profile. Young black women, dark-complexioned, slender in frame, short in stature with short hair. This was not coincidence born of random circumstance. This was selection. This was the expression of a fixed internal preference, a predatory imagination that had, over a significant period of time, constructed a very specific image of the person it wanted to destroy. The consistency of that preference across 5 separate victims speaks to a level of deliberateness that is deeply, profoundly unsettling. It tells you that whoever was doing the choosing had thought about this, had rehearsed it, had refined it, had, perhaps, tested variations of it before arriving at the winter of 1986 with his methodology fully formed. The wooded area that would become his disposal ground sat adjacent to the Bradbury Recreation Center, a community space designed for exactly the kind of wholesome neighborhood activity that defines ordinary life in suburban America. Place for children, place for families, a place where the idea of violence felt remote and impossible. The irony is almost too heavy to carry. Right next to the swings and the open grass, behind a tree line that thickened just enough in the right places to offer concealment from passing eyes, the earth was quietly receiving the dead. The bodies were not buried in any deep or elaborate fashion. There was no careful excavation, no attempt to permanently hide what had been done. They were simply left, placed or dropped into the undergrowth and abandoned, surrendered to the mercy of time and weather and the slow, indifferent work of decomposition. In the autumn and early winter of 1986, time moved quickly and quietly over them while the community went about its daily life just yards away, completely unaware. The first victim to be officially discovered was Dorothy Ann Miller, 20 years old. Her body was found on December 13, 1986, in that wooded stretch near the recreation center. She was young, slight of build, with short hair, fitting precisely the physical profile that would emerge as the killer's unmistakable calling card. The investigators who first processed the scene approached it with the assumptions their experience had trained them to bring. This area, this demographic, this era. A drug-related death seemed, on the surface, like the most probable explanation. Cocaine was present in Dorothy's system, and in 1986, in a community being consumed by the crack epidemic, that finding alone carried enormous weight in the minds of investigators who had seen the same story play out dozens of times. Her case was initially treated accordingly. A tragedy, certainly, but a familiar kind of tragedy. The kind that generated paperwork rather than task forces. But then the ground gave up more of its secrets. In the days and weeks following Dorothy's discovery, other bodies began to emerge from that same patch of woodland, and the accumulated horror of what was unfolding forced investigators to return to Dorothy's case with fresh and far more urgent eyes. What the deeper autopsy analysis then confirmed shifted the entire complexion of the investigation. Dorothy Ann Miller had been viciously raped before her death. The sexual assault had been brutal, deliberate, and thorough. Not the incidental violence of a drug transaction gone wrong, but the central act of a predator who had targeted her specifically and done to her exactly what he had intended to do from the beginning. The cocaine in her bloodstream may not have been her own choice at all. It may have been administered, offered as a gift, or concealed in something she consumed, as a chemical instrument of control, a way to reduce her capacity to resist or flee before the violence that followed. The drug was not the story. The drug was the tool. But Dorothy was not, as investigators eventually determined, the first to die. She was simply the first to be found. When investigators began carefully tracing the timeline of disappearances against the physical state of the other victims' remains, specifically the degree to which decomposition had progressed, a grim and clarifying truth emerged. Dorothy's body was actually the freshest of those discovered in the woodland. The others had been lying out there considerably longer, quietly being reclaimed by the earth through the weeks of autumn rain and dropping temperatures, while their families had been waiting for any word, any phone call, any sign that their daughters and sisters were still somewhere in the world. The killer had been at work for months before anyone understood that a killer was at work. He had operated in absolute invisibility while Suitland moved around him. Pamela Malcolm was 25 years old. She held a position with the United States Patent Office, a federal employee, a woman who moved through institutional spaces, who had a schedule and responsibilities, and a mother she shared an apartment with in Suitland. On the evening of October 21st, 1986, she stepped out of that apartment. She was going to buy a pack of cigarettes. It was the kind of errand that requires no deliberation, no preparation, no particular thought, the kind of thing you do in the space between other things, a 10-minute interruption in an ordinary evening. She walked out into the October night. She did not come back. Her mother waited. The hours accumulated into something that could no longer be explained by a delayed return or an impromptu visit with a friend. Pamela Malcolm was reported missing. and the silence that followed her disappearance stretched forward into weeks of searching and hoping and praying, until the woodland near Bradbury gave its answer. Juanita Walls was 26 years old, and she was supposed to be celebrating. On October 30th, 1986, she left her apartment in Washington, D.C., to attend a birthday party being held in her honor, a gathering organized by the people who loved her, who had gone to the deliberate trouble of planning something joyful specifically because she mattered to them. She had people waiting for her with decorations and food and the particular warmth that comes from being known and valued by a community of people who chose to mark your existence. She promised to be there. She had every reason to arrive. The party began. The hours passed. Juanita Walls did not come through the door. She did not call. She simply was not there, and then she continued not being there, and then the searching began, and then the winter settled in, and then the woodland answered for her too. On November 10th, 1986, Cynthia Westbury, 22 years old, told her sister she was stepping out to visit a friend. "I'll be right back," she said. 4 words so unremarkable, so completely stripped of any weight or premonition, that they lodge in the mind with a particular cruelty once you know what happened next. She walked out the door of her home and vanished from the world as 3 perfectly ordinary evenings in the span of 3 weeks. And at the time, none of these disappearances was formally connected to either of the others. Each one fell into a different jurisdictional space, different police precincts, different reporting structures, different detective assignments. The connections that seemed so visible in retrospect, laid out against each other on the timeline, were not visible to any single investigator at the moment they were occurring because no single investigator was seeing all 3 simultaneously. This is one of the most devastating operational realities of serial predation in dense, multi-jurisdictional urban environments. The killer's geography becomes one of his most effective weapons. By moving between Suitland and the neighboring areas of southeast Washington, the person responsible ensured that the picture he was assembling remained fragmented among the agencies that might have recognized it. By the time anyone thought to lay the pieces side by side, the bodies were already in the ground and had been there for weeks. When those bodies finally emerged from the woodland in December and into January, the condition of the remains told an additional layer of the story that the families were not prepared to hear and that investigators were not entirely prepared to process. The degree of decomposition was severe. Weeks of exposure to the elements, the autumn rains, the cold nights, the biological processes that begin working on a human body the moment life leaves it, had done significant damage to the physical evidence. The consistent victim profile, the consistent disposal location, the consistent method, accumulating across the bodies like a repeated signature on an unsigned letter. By the time December gave way to January and the full scope of what had been happening in Suitland became publicly known, the neighborhood had been fundamentally altered. Not in any visible structural way. The apartment complexes still stood, the recreation center still existed, the streets still connected the same points they always had. But the invisible architecture of the place had shifted irrevocably. Fear had settled over Suitland like a second winter, colder and more penetrating than the actual cold. Women made decisions differently. They calculated routes, they arranged companions, they checked in with each other in ways that had not been necessary before. They locked their doors with a different intention. They listened to sounds in hallways with a different attention. The community had arrived, through grief and discovery and the long, awful arithmetic of 5 missing women, at the understanding that something had been choosing from among them. And the most terrifying part of that understanding was the accompanying knowledge that it might not yet be finished. January 1987 arrived in Suitland carrying cold air and dread in proportions that felt almost deliberately calibrated to overwhelm. The discovery of the bodies in the wooded area near Bradbury Recreation Center had by now officially shattered whatever fragile and largely performative sense of normalcy the community had managed to sustain through the closing weeks of 1986. People had suspected. Neighbors had whispered. Mothers had warned their daughters with a specificity and urgency that went beyond the general cautions of ordinary parental anxiety. But suspicion and official confirmation are different animals entirely, and when Prince George's County law enforcement formally acknowledged that they were investigating a series of connected homicides, that the women in the woods had not died separately or coincidentally but had been taken by the same deliberate hand. The confirmation landed on the community with a weight that suspicion alone had not been able to produce. They were living inside the answer while the authorities were still constructing the official question. Now the question had been asked aloud, and the answer was as terrible as they had feared. The Prince George's County Police Department responded by assembling a dedicated task force of 25 officers, a substantial commitment of investigative resources for an unincorporated suburban jurisdiction operating within the financial and logistical constraints of a mid-1980s county police department. 25 officers pulling files, canvassing streets, following leads, interviewing witnesses, building timelines. They began combing through every available fragment of information with the systematic intensity that the scale of the crime demanded. Witness accounts were collected and cross-referenced. Missing person reports were pulled and examined for connections that had not been visible when each one was filed in isolation. Receipts from bars and convenience stores were traced. Drug networks operating in the affected neighborhoods were mapped as thoroughly as cooperative sources would allow. Neighborhood gossip, often dismissed as unreliable but frequently the most accurate intelligence available in communities where formal cooperation with law enforcement is complicated by history, was gathered and weighed. Investigators raided establishments in the red light districts of Washington, D.C., looking for anyone who might have seen something, known something, heard something in the weeks and months before the bodies surfaced. They spoke to relatives of the victims, to their friends, to the people who had last seen them alive and had been living with the guilt of that timing ever since. They followed threads. They followed leads. They followed hunches and intuitions and the kind of investigative instinct that develops over years of working violent crime. And the threads broke. The leads dissolved. The hunches ran into walls. The investigation continued moving in the dark. One avenue of inquiry briefly seemed to carry genuine promise. Investigators established that at least 2 of the Suitland victims had, at various points, frequented an establishment called Clancy's, a bar operating in the southeast Washington, D.C. corridor that served the community the victims moved through. The significance of a shared social space cannot be overstated in a serial murder investigation. A common location creates the possibility of a common encounter, a place where the killer might have first observed his targets, made his selections, initiated the approach. Bars are environments of lowered guard. They are places where strangers speak to each other, where offers are made and accepted, where the normal caution that people carry through their daily lives is partially suspended in the warmth of company and alcohol. If the killer had been operating out of Clancy's, or even simply observing from within it, then that bar became one of the most important pieces of geography in the entire investigation. Detectives moved on it hard. They spoke to the owner. They spoke to the staff. They spoke to regular patrons. And what they encountered, systematically and without exception, was a wall. The connection, under the rigorous pressure of thorough investigation, could not be solidly established. The potential link between Clancy's and the murders dissolved under examination. The thread snapped, and the investigation returned to the dark. What investigators were assembling during this period, even as individual leads failed, was something more durable and more disturbing than any single piece of evidence. A profile. A portrait of the killer's operating methodology built from the accumulated weight of what was consistent across all 5 deaths. The victims were not random. This point cannot be stated often enough or with sufficient emphasis. The physical consistency, young, black, dark-complexioned, slender, short-haired, was so precise across 5 separate victims that it functioned as a kind of signature. A predator with a type this specific has not arrived at it accidentally. The type is the product of a fantasy, of an internal image that has been cultivated and refined over time, that has perhaps been acted upon before in ways that did not escalate to murder but that established the template. It spoke of a man who had spent significant time in his own mind constructing the exact dimensions of what he wanted to destroy. That level of psychological specificity is one of the most chilling findings in any serial murder investigation, because it tells you that the violence was not impulsive. It was not the product of an explosive and uncontrollable moment. It was chosen deliberately and in advance, with the cold clarity of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had decided to do it anyway. The mechanics of the approach, the method by which the killer got close enough to his victims to control them, was a question that haunted the investigation and admits of no entirely certain answer even now. What is clear is that these women did not vanish from crowded, well-lit public spaces in moments of obvious violence. There were no witnesses to abductions. No one reported seeing a woman being dragged into a vehicle or forced off a street against her will. The disappearances were quiet. They were clean. The women walked out of their homes or apartments and simply ceased to be visible, which means the transition from free person to victim occurred in a space and moment that left no observable trace in the environment. This kind of clean disappearance is the signature of an approach built on something other than brute force, at least in its initial stages. It speaks of familiarity, or the convincing performance of familiarity. It speaks of an offer that was accepted, a ride, a conversation, a substance, something that gave the killer proximity without triggering the alarm response that visible threat would have produced. In the context of a community being consumed by the crack epidemic, the offer of drugs, or the pretense of a drug transaction, would have been a devastatingly effective tool for getting close to someone whose choices were being shaped by addiction. Dorothy Miller's toxicology results speak directly to this possibility. The cocaine in her system may have been the price of admission to her trust, offered freely by someone who knew exactly what it would cost him and what it would cost her. The violence that followed the approach was not restrained. It was not the minimum necessary to achieve a goal. It was extensive, deliberate, and thorough, and in that thoroughness, it reveals something essential and deeply disturbing about the person perpetrating it. Every victim who could be forensically assessed with sufficient certainty had been subjected to sexual assault. The assaults were not incidental. They were not secondary. They were, by every available indicator, the primary purpose of the attacks. The thing the killer came for, the thing that drove the selection and the approach and the terrible patience of the planning. What followed the assault was murder, and the murder appears to have been instrumental rather than passionate. Not the explosion of some overwhelming emotional state, but the cold, practical decision of a man who understood that living witnesses were a liability he could not afford. The blade, a knife or similar cutting instrument, was the tool of that decision. Multiple stab wounds were identified in the cases where the physical evidence had been preserved sufficiently by the cold temperatures and the timeline to allow for that determination. The stab wounds were not surgical. They did not speak of clinical detachment or technical precision. They spoke of force, of repetition, of a person who applied the blade with the kind of physical commitment that leaves no ambiguity about intention. Juanita Walls, 26 years old, fought back. This fact sits at the center of this case with an intensity that no amount of time has been able to diminish, because it is a fact about character, about who Juanita Walls was in the moment when every possible resource a human being possesses was required all at once. She did not accept what was being done to her without resistance. Her niece, Donna Blackeny, who was 21 years old when Juanita was taken, told reporters in the aftermath of the case something that has lodged permanently in the memory of everyone who has followed this story. Juanita had long fingernails, strong ones, and beneath those fingernails, when investigators processed the evidence from her remains, they found skin. Human skin that did not belong to Juanita Walls. The skin of the person who killed her, scratched free by her own hands in the final desperate moments of her life. Juanita Walls marked her killer. She left his biological material beneath her nails as an act of defiance so profound and so instinctive that it transcends description. In 1987, DNA profiling technology was not the routine forensic instrument it would later become. The databases that now allow investigators to match biological material to specific individuals across decades were either non-existent or inaccessible for standard criminal investigations. The skin beneath Juanita Walls's fingernails sat in an evidence bag with no name to be matched against it. That evidence, potentially the single most decisive physical piece of proof in the entire case, existed in a kind of suspended state, present, real, biological, and entirely without resolution. Angela Wilkerson was 22 years old. She disappeared on January 5, 1987, after the discovery of the first bodies had already begun, after the community already knew something was deeply and dangerously wrong, after the warnings had been issued and the fear had been named publicly. She was the last of the 5 women whose deaths were officially and formally linked to the same perpetrator. Her body was recovered 8 days after her disappearance, on January 13th. The pattern held without variation: sexual assault, stab wounds, disposal in the woodland near Bradbury. The consistency was no longer just evidence of a single mind behind the crimes. It was, by this point, something that read almost like a statement, a repeated declaration made in violence, each repetition confirming what the previous one had established. The formal linking of the 5 deaths, Dorothy Miller, Pamela Malcolm, Juanita Walls, Cynthia Westbury, Angela Wilkerson, into a single connected series was a critical investigative milestone. But it was also a profoundly insufficient one, because the linking of 5 deaths into a series does not name the person responsible. It does not close the distance between the crime and the criminal. It does not bring anyone to a courtroom or put any answer in front of any family. It simply makes the shape of the horror clearer and, in doing so, makes the urgency of finding the perpetrator more acute. The investigation intensified. The task force expanded its reach. And somewhere in the margins of southeast Washington and Suitland, the person who had done all of this continued to exist, breathing, moving, living the ordinary surface life that had protected him through 5 murders, and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next came not from the woodland near Bradbury, but from a northeast Washington alleyway, and from the death of a young woman whose name was Janice Elaine Morton. And it would change everything, or very nearly everything, about where this investigation was headed. Alton Alonso Best did not look like a monster. This is the first thing worth establishing, and it is worth establishing with complete plainness, not as a defense of anything he did or anything he was suspected of doing, but because it is the truth that makes cases like this one so persistently and deeply terrifying. The monster of popular imagination announces itself. It wears its malevolence on its surface. It makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up the moment it enters a room, and the alarm it triggers in you feels almost biological, a warning system working as designed. Alton Best was not that. He was 30 years old at the time of his arrest. He was unemployed, moving through the lower margins of southeast Washington's social landscape with the particular invisibility that poverty and obscurity together confer. He had girlfriends. He had a social world. He had a nephew who wore a badge and carried a gun as a sworn officer of the District of Columbia Metropolitan Police Department. He was, in every dimension that a casual observer might assess, one of the thousands upon thousands of men living quietly difficult and largely undistinguished lives in the greater Washington area during the economically brutal mid-1980s. He did not stand out. He did not alarm. And that is precisely why what the evidence eventually revealed about him was so comprehensively and lastingly disturbing. Janice Elaine Morton was 20 years old and working as a nurse's aide at a Washington hospital. A young woman with direction, with professional purpose, with a life organized around caring for people in their most vulnerable moments. On January 15, 1987, her body was found in a northeast Washington, D.C. alleyway. She had been beaten with a savagery that left nothing ambiguous about the force applied, and she had been strangled to death. The beating and the strangulation had taken place not in the alley where she was found but inside a vehicle, a black van, to which her body had then been transported and discarded. Her physical profile matched the Suitland victims with a precision that immediately drew the attention of investigators who were already deep inside the Woodland murders case. Young, black, dark-complexioned, short, slight, short-haired, and she had been sexually assaulted. The van was the thread. Investigators identified it and traced its registration. The black van belonged to William Arma, Alton Best's nephew, the serving Metropolitan Police officer who was promptly placed on administrative leave while the investigation around the vehicle he owned consumed the attention of detectives from multiple agencies. Arma himself was not the target. The target was the man whose use of that van the evidence pointed toward, Alton Alonso Best. When investigators began pulling on the thread of Best's connection to Janice Morton, they found that the thread led in directions that extended far beyond a single murder in a northeast Washington alleyway. They began constructing a map, a geographical and social map of Best's life and movements. And when they laid that map alongside the map of the Suitland murders, the overlaps were immediate and numerous and deeply uncomfortable. In 1984, Best and his nephew William Arma had lived together in a house in Suitland. That house was located approximately 1 kilometer from the wooded area near Bradbury Recreation Center, the precise location where 5 women had been left in the ground. 1 kilometer, 12 minutes on foot at a casual pace. Close enough to know the terrain in the particular way that only regular presence creates, which sections of the treeline thickened enough to absorb a human shape, which paths away from the parking areas avoided the nearest streetlights, which patches of undergrowth were deep enough and dense enough to conceal what needed to be concealed until the earth and weather could begin their work. The social connections proved equally disturbing in their density. Best and at least one of the Suitland murder victims had shared the same drug supplier, the same individual dealer, operating in the Southeast Washington network that served the communities both Best and the victim moved through. This was not a vague regional overlap. This was a specific shared point of contact. The same person, the same transaction location, the same chemical economy. Another of the Suitland victims had lived on the very street where Best's ex-wife and his children resided. These were not the kinds of coincidences that statistical randomness produces cleanly and innocently. These were the kinds of connections that accumulate around a predator who hunts within his own ecosystem, who selects from the population he is embedded in, who knows his targets not as strangers but as faces he has seen, as names he has heard, as people whose patterns and vulnerabilities are legible to him because he has been close enough, long enough to read them. Best admitted, in the proceedings that followed, that he had a habit of spending time seeking out young women living in difficult circumstances, women who were economically precarious, who were struggling with addiction, who were isolated from the protective social structures that might otherwise have buffered them. He described this as a social practice, as a way he moved through his free time. He did not describe it as predation. He did not use that word or anything close to it. But the description he provided mapped with extraordinary precision onto the profile of every woman whose body had been found in the Suitland woodland. The mechanism he described, identifying vulnerable women, establishing proximity, offering something, was indistinguishable from a methodology of targeted predation. The words he used were softer than that. The reality they described was not. The black van's history reached further back than the Janice Morton murder, and what it reached back to is one of the most revealing details in the entire case. Court records from 1981, 6 full years before the Suitland murders, document that Alton Best had been charged with armed robbery and kidnapping. The instrument of those crimes was a black van. He had, in 1981, forced 2 young women at gunpoint into the back of a black van and bound them. He had told them, as the van was moving, that he was taking them to Maryland. To Maryland, the precise state where the Suitland woodland would later receive 5 bodies. The women, through an act of physical resourcefulness that saved their lives, worked free from their restraints while the vehicle was in motion and managed to escape. They survived. They reported what had happened. They told investigators what Best had said about his destination. Whatever consequence that 1981 case produced, it did not result in Alton Best being permanently removed from the streets of Washington. And so, 6 years later, another black van, another set of victims, another destination that ended in Maryland soil. On June 10, 1987, Alton Alonso Best appeared in D.C. Superior Court before Judge Reggie Walton and entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder and sodomy in connection with the death of Janice Elaine Morton. He admitted that he had beaten her. He admitted the sexual violation. He accepted the plea arrangement and the sentence it carried: 18 years and 4 months in federal custody. The courtroom received this without the catharsis that justice is supposed to produce, because the people most affected by the broader series of crimes, the families of the 5 women in the Suitland woodland, were sitting with an outcome that addressed 1 death and left 5 others formally unresolved. The sentence felt, to many of them and to many observers of the case, like arithmetic performed on the wrong numbers. Because the plea covered Janice Morton and Janice Morton alone. The 5 women of Suitland, Dorothy and Miller, Pamela Malcolm, Juanita Walls, Cynthia Westbury, Angela Wilkerson, were not included. Best denied any knowledge of them. He denied any involvement in their deaths. He looked investigators in the face and said the Suitland murders had nothing to do with him. And despite the kilometer of distance between his former home and their graves, despite the shared drug connection, despite the neighboring street where another victim had lived near his own children, despite the 1981 kidnapping attempt headed for Maryland, despite the perfectly matching victim profile, despite the black van and all that the black van carried, despite all of it, the evidentiary framework that a criminal prosecution requires could not be assembled to the standard that a courtroom demands. Physical evidence degraded by weeks of outdoor exposure. No eyewitness placing best at the woodland site. No confession. No DNA match because the technology for routine DNA matching in criminal cases was not yet in place. The law requires more than a compelling and suffocating architecture of circumstance. It requires proof that survives cross-examination. And that proof in the Suitland murders could not be sufficiently constructed. What the investigators were left with instead was a fact that defied innocent explanation but could not be legally leveraged. The killing stopped. Completely. Absolutely. The moment Alton Best was removed from the streets of Washington and placed into custody, the pattern of violence that had consumed Suitland and the surrounding area for 5 months ceased without remainder. No new bodies fitting the profile appeared in the Bradbury woodland. No new disappearances matching the pattern were reported. The predator, whoever he was, simply stopped. And in the geography of this case, that stopping is perhaps the single most significant piece of evidence that no evidence locker ever contained. The guardian angels arrived in Suitland in the final weeks of January 1987, their red berets visible on the same streets where the killer had moved invisibly for months. They walked the apartment complexes. They walked the routes between bus stops and front doors. They made themselves available to community members who had information they were unwilling to carry to a police department whose relationship with this neighborhood was not one of uncomplicated trust. The residents who spoke to the guardian angels rather than to detectives were not obstructing justice. They were navigating a rational and historically grounded reluctance to engage with an institution that had not always served them. The police response, treating the guardian angels as obstacles rather than as a community resource, reflected an institutional inability to understand why so many people living inside this terror did not default to the police as their first or most trusted recourse. The community's fear during this period was not abstract or theoretical. It was daily and physical and specific. It lived in the extra seconds women spent checking that the door was locked behind them, in the phone calls made to confirm that a friend had arrived home safely, in the routes deliberately chosen for their lighting rather than their convenience, in the mothers who stood at windows watching the street below until they saw their daughters turn the corner and come inside. Crystal Smith, 26 years old and a Suitland resident, put it as plainly as it could be put when a reporter asked her to describe what life in the neighborhood had become. There is a lot of fear. 3 words carrying the entire weight of 5 months of organized violence against the women of her community. 3 words that contained the sleepless nights and the locked doors and the curtains pulled against the dark and the silent, perpetual calculation of risk that had replaced the ordinary, unconsidered freedom of moving through a neighborhood you were supposed to be safe in. Justice, in the Suitland murders, arrived in a shape that satisfied no one. Not the exhausted investigators who had spent months wading through the wreckage of 5 lives and had followed every thread available to them with the full weight of their professional commitment. Not the families who had buried their daughters and sisters and nieces during the coldest months of that terrible winter and had sat through the legal proceedings that followed hoping for something proportional to what had been taken from them, and certainly not the community of Suitland itself, which had lived inside the nightmare at close range and had emerged from it without the clean ending that human beings need when they have witnessed something so vast and so deliberate in its cruelty. What arrived instead was a plea arrangement for a single murder, the killing of Janice Elaine Morton, a sentence of 18 years and 4 months, and the formal legal silence that settled over the 5 deaths in the Bradbury woodland like a final layer of earth. The 5 women were not named in any guilty plea. Their killer was not identified in any courtroom. Their cases remained open in the technical sense of that phrase, which means they remained unresolved in the only sense that matters to the people who love them. The limbo this produced for the families of Dorothy Miller, Pamela Malcolm, Juanita Walls, Cynthia Westbury, and Angela Wilkerson occupies a category of human suffering that has no clean name and resists easy description. It is distinct from the grief that follows a death with a known cause and a known perpetrator, which is devastating in its own way but at least has a shape, a defendant, a verdict, a sentence, a moment when the system acknowledges the wrong that was done and assigns it to a responsible party. It is equally distinct from the particular torment of families whose loved ones are simply missing, where the absence of a body leaves open the terrible, enduring possibility that somewhere the person is still alive. The families of the Suitland victims occupied a space between these two forms of loss. They knew their daughters and sisters were dead. They knew the deaths had been violent and sexual and deliberate, and they had been told, not in any formal statement but in the accumulated silence of the legal outcome, that no one would be held formally responsible for those specific deaths. You are left with the what and denied the who, and without the who there is no place to direct the grief, no target for the fury, no face to put in front of the fact and say, this was done by a specific human being who made specific choices, and that human being has been made to account for them. The circumstantial case against Alton Best for the broader series of Suitland murders was, by the assessment of both investigators and journalists who covered the case in real time, overwhelming in its density and its directional clarity. Every major piece of circumstantial evidence pointed in the same direction. The geography pointed there. The shared drug connection pointed there. The physical proximity of his former residence to the disposal site pointed there. The perfectly consistent victim profile pointed there. The 1981 kidnapping attempt, with its black van and its stated Maryland destination, pointed there with a directness that made it difficult to look at anything else. And then there was the fact that stopped every other fact in its tracks and demanded the full attention of everyone examining the case. The killing stopped when Best was arrested. Not gradually, not with a trailing diminishment, immediately and completely. 5 months of escalating violence against women in a specific geographic corridor, and then, on the day that Alton Best was removed from those streets, the violence ceased. No new victims, no new bodies, no new reports of women disappearing from that community matching that profile from that woodland. Nothing. The predator, whoever he was, simply ceased to operate. And that cessation, perfectly and precisely timed to Best's removal, is the kind of fact that does not occur in innocent coincidence. But the law in the United States does not convict on circumstantial weight alone, no matter how heavy that weight becomes. It requires evidence capable of meeting the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Evidence that can survive the adversarial process of a criminal trial, that can withstand cross-examination by skilled defense attorneys, that can be placed before a jury and assessed against the highest evidentiary bar that the legal system imposes. In 1987, in the specific evidentiary circumstances of the Suitland murders, those requirements could not be met. The bodies had been subjected to weeks of outdoor exposure in a Maryland autumn and early winter, and the decomposition had worked against the physical evidence in ways that degraded critical categories of forensic information. No witness existed who could place Best at the Bradbury woodland during the relevant period. And the piece of evidence that might, in another era, have resolved everything. The human skin recovered from beneath Juanita Walls's fingernails, the biological material she had scratched from the face of the person killing her in the last moments of her life, could not be matched to a specific individual because the forensic infrastructure to perform that matching was not yet available for routine criminal investigation in 1987. Juanita Walls had done everything a person could do in her position. She had fought. She had marked her attacker. She had left the evidence. And the system that was supposed to use that evidence to deliver justice for her did not yet possess the tools to do so. That gap between what she gave and what the system could use is one of the most painful dimensions of the entire case. The years that followed Best's plea and sentencing brought a series of additional developments that complicated the official narrative of the case and refused to allow it to settle into the clean resolution that the formal legal outcome implied. On April 5, 1987, weeks after Best had been placed into custody, weeks after the killings were supposed to have ended, the naked body of a woman was discovered on a Washington, D.C. street. 5 days after that, a 25-year-old Suitland resident came forward to report that a stranger had attempted to force her into a vehicle. Neither of these incidents was officially connected to the Suitland murder series. Both of them landed in the consciousness of the community and of the investigators who were still living with the case with the force of something that could not be easily explained away. If Best was the Suitland killer, then these events required explanation. If he was not, If the person responsible for the 5 deaths in the Bradbury woodland remained free, then these events were something else entirely. Resumption, continuation, the next chapter of something not yet finished. On June 24th of that same year, the body of Cheryl Henderson, 21 years old, was found in a wooded area near southeast Washington, less than 2 kilometers from Suitland, in terrain that bore a geographical resemblance to the Bradbury site that was difficult to dismiss as meaningless. Her throat had been cut. She was young, black, slight. In September, the remains of an unidentified young woman were recovered from an abandoned housing complex. Donna Nichols had been beaten to death in April. Each of these deaths arrived at the doorstep of an investigation that had officially concluded, and each one demanded a response from investigators who were now required to treat them as unrelated to the series they had spent months investigating. That position may have been correct. There is no available evidence that definitively connects these subsequent deaths to the Suitland murders or to Alton Best. But the requirement to treat them as unconnected, the institutional need to maintain the narrative that the threat had ended with Best's arrest, created a kind of forced certainty that the actual facts of the situation did not fully support. 2 Los Angeles Police Department detectives traveled to Washington during the investigation to interview Best in connection with the so-called Southside Slayer case, a series of murders targeting black women in the Los Angeles area between 1983 and 1986 that had produced national law enforcement concern and almost no proportional national media attention. The LAPD detectives were part of a broader investigative effort to determine whether any of the killings attributed to the Southside Slayer designation might be connected across jurisdictional lines to similar patterns of violence being documented on the East Coast. Best was examined as a possible person of interest in the California murders. Nothing definitive emerged from that examination, and no formal connection between Best and the Los Angeles killings was ever established. But the fact that his name had traveled 3,000 miles to appear in a separate serial murder investigation, that investigators on the other side of the country considered him sufficiently compelling as a suspect to make the trip to Washington, tells you something precise and irreversible about the gravity of the circumstantial cloud that surrounded him. Years later, the Southside Slayer designation was itself revealed to be a forensic and investigative misnomer. The murders grouped under that name in California were eventually determined to be the work of at least 6 distinct and entirely unrelated perpetrators. None of them had any connection to Suitland, to Prince George's County, or to Alton Best. The cross-jurisdictional threads dissolved back into their separate and unrelated origins. But the Suitland case received no such clarifying resolution. It was not determined to be the work of multiple killers whose crimes had been incorrectly aggregated. It remained, in the assessment of investigators and in the weight of the available evidence, the work of a single deliberate mind. A mind that had never been formally identified, indicted, or convicted of the 5 deaths it was believed to have caused. 15-year-old Dottie Shaw sat on the front steps of a red brick apartment building in Whitehall Square in Suitland, sometime in the months after the case had closed as fully as it would ever close. She sat with her friends in the late afternoon light, the pink-skied, ordinary light of a community going about the business of surviving. She talked, when a reporter who had come to document the neighborhood's experience approached, about the previous year. Not about it abstractly, not as a news story she had followed on a television that sat in a room down the hall, as something that had happened in her immediate physical world, in the space she moved through every day, in the field that she could see from the steps she was sitting on. She was 15 years old and she had grown up, across the past 5 months, alongside active predation. She had gone to school, come home, argued with her friends, laughed about ordinary things, and all the while, on the other side of the tree-line that she could see from her own front steps, the earth had been holding the dead. That is what a serial killer leaves behind in a community. Not just grief, and not just fear, but a permanent alteration of the way the ordinary world is experienced. The steps become different steps. The tree-line becomes a different tree-line. The pink light of an ordinary afternoon carries a memory that does not dissolve. The Suitland murders were never closed. Alton Best served his sentence for the murder of Janice Morton and was released. The 5 deaths in the Bradbury woodland remain, on paper, an open investigation, which means, in the language of bureaucratic reality, that a file exists in a cabinet somewhere, that 5 names are preserved in a database, that a theoretical mechanism for revisiting the evidence exists if someone were to bring forward something new and credible and sufficient. In the language of human reality, what open investigation means for the families of Dorothy and Miller, Pamela Malcolm, Juanita Walls, Cynthia Westbury, and Angela Wilkerson is something the bureaucratic language cannot contain. It means that the decades have passed without a verdict, without a guilty plea that included their daughters' names, without a moment in a courtroom when a specific human being was made to stand before the law and the public and the families and say, "I did this. I am responsible for this specific life that I took." The absence of that moment is not a technicality. It is not a procedural footnote. It is the central wound of this case, and it has not healed. The woodland near Bradbury Recreation Center is still there. The red brick apartment complexes of Whitehall Square still stand in Suitland. The suburb that was gripped by organized, predatory violence during 3 months of an autumn and winter nearly 4 decades ago has continued to exist, to change, to receive new residents and new generations who were not alive in 1986 and may have no awareness that the ground near their neighborhood park once held 5 women who were placed there by a man who has never been formally required to answer for them. The case has not gone away because this kind of case does not go away. It persists in the consciousness of everyone who has looked at it closely enough to feel its weight. 5 young black women, killed in a community without the institutional power to demand from the justice system what wealthier and more visible communities might have demanded and received. 5 deaths that were real and documented and whose violence was extensive and whose victims were specific people with names and jobs and mothers and friends and birthday parties planned in their honor. 5 deaths for which no one has ever formally and completely answered. Dorothy and Miller deserved to come home from a walk that lasted 10 minutes. Pamela Malcolm deserved to buy her cigarettes and return to her mother's apartment. Juanita Walls deserved to walk through the door of her own birthday party. Cynthia Westbury deserved for "I'll be right back" to be true. Angela Wilkerson deserved to survive the month of January. They all deserved the ordinary safety of the streets they lived on. They deserved investigators armed with every tool that science and technology could provide. They deserved a legal system capable of reaching the person responsible and delivering a verdict that put his name next to his actions on an official and permanent record. They deserved, at the absolute minimum, at the lowest possible threshold of what justice can offer, to have the name of the person who ended them spoken aloud in a court of law. That silence, the silence where the verdict should have been, the silence that followed the arrest and the plea and the sentence that covered 1 death and left 5 others unnamed, is the defining sound of the Suitland murders. It is a silence shaped precisely like an unanswered question. And after nearly 4 decades, it still echoes in the woodland near the park where children play, in the steps of the apartment complex where a 15-year-old girl once sat and described a year that had changed her understanding of the world forever, and in every conversation about these 5 women that does not end with justice. It echoes, and it will keep echoing until someone, somewhere, finally makes it stop. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our 3rd story. Story 3. The Phantom of Komutov, Czechoslovakia's most disturbing post-war secret. Václav Mrazek, a.k.a. the Forest Wraith. There are men who kill out of rage, men who kill out of greed, and then, far beneath both, there are men who kill because something inside them died long before their victims ever did. Picture a quiet Czechoslovakian countryside in the early 1950s. Rolling forests, dirt roads cutting between sleepy villages. A post-war nation trying desperately to breathe again, to forget the horror that had just swallowed the world whole. The people of Komutov hung their laundry, tended their fields, and walked their children to school. They believed the worst was behind them, but somewhere among them, cycling through those same dirt roads, nodding politely at neighbors, cheering at football matches on Sunday afternoons, moved a man who carried an entirely different world inside him. A world of darkness so complete, so absolute, that no one who looked into his eyes ever saw it until it was far, far too late. He was not a monster draped in shadow. He was your coworker, your neighbor, the shy, quiet fellow who kept mostly to himself and smiled when greeted. He was Václav Mrazek. And for 6 years, while police stumbled, while a broken political system buried its most experienced investigators and replaced them with obedient recruits who had never solved a murder in their lives, Mrazek walked freely through the forests of northern Bohemia, leaving bodies in ditches, in streams, in secluded clearings, and then went home, ate his supper, slept soundly, and waited for the next one. This is the story of the man they called the Forest Wraith. The man who committed 127 documented crimes. The man who murdered at least 7 people and violated the dead. The man who nearly got away with all of it, and who, in the end, was not caught because of brilliant detective work, but because of a stolen hair clipper sitting in a locker room. This is the story of Václav Mrazek, and it is one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of Central European crime. To understand what Václav Mrazek became, you must first stand inside the world that built him. A world of poverty so grinding it left marks on the bones. A world where hunger was not a metaphor but a daily companion that slept beside you and woke you before dawn. He was born on the 22nd of October 1925 in Svinarov, a small, unremarkable village that history would never have noticed were it not for the man it produced. He entered the world as the latest in a long line of children born to a family stretched far past its limits. 12 children in total, though the cruelty of those early years claimed 4 of them before they ever had a chance to grow. The Mrazek household was not a home in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a place of surviving. A place where meals were not guaranteed, where warmth in winter was a luxury, where the future was a concept too expensive to entertain. His father was a miner. He was also a drinker, the kind of man who came home with coal-black hands and coal-black moods, whose belt was as familiar as his voice, whose idea of parenting was correction through pain. He beat his wife, he beat his children, and somewhere in the midst of all that violence, he made a decision that would ripple out into history in the most horrifying way imaginable. He decided that his children would learn to steal. Not sneaking candy from a market stall. Not pocketing loose change. Systematic, deliberate theft, food, clothing, whatever the family needed. Václav and his brother Karel were taught the craft as though it were a trade, as though their father were passing down a skill from generation to generation. And Václav, it turned out, was gifted, unervingly gifted. He moved with a quietness that did not draw attention. He studied his targets. He waited. He planned. His father, recognizing the talent, made him instruct his younger siblings as well. The teacher of thieves was barely a teenager. His mother, rather than counteracting this influence, encouraged it. The family needed to eat. Morality was a concept for people who had enough. Václav absorbed this lesson deeply, the idea that rules were for others, that need justified method, that the world owed you what it had failed to provide. School ended for him after the 5th grade. Not because he was unintelligent. Those who would later study him forensically would note that he operated with chilling organization and methodical precision, but because education was a privilege his family could not sustain. So instead of books and classrooms, Václav Mrazek had forests and roads and the long, empty stretches of a Czechoslovakian countryside that asked no questions and offered no witnesses. In 1941, when he was barely 16 years old, he was caught. A theft like so many before it, but this time the law reached him. He received a conditional sentence and spent 18 months behind bars. Prison, rather than reforming him, simply sharpened him. It stripped away whatever remaining illusions he had about the social contract, the notion that society protected you if you played by its rules. He had never been protected. Why should he protect anything in return? Upon his release, Mrazek attempted something that many would later find darkly ironic. He applied to become a police officer. He also sought entry into the military. Both applications were rejected. He was too small in stature, they said. The institutions that might have channeled his particular brand of cold-eyed precision into something lawful turned him away. So instead, in 1946, he enlisted as an armed escort for a humanitarian convoy heading to Romania and Bulgaria. It was during this journey, watching soldiers strip supplies, watching men exchange rations for sexual favors, watching authority collapse into appetite, that whatever internal compass Mrazek still possessed began pointing somewhere darker than it ever had before. He returned from that convoy a changed man, or perhaps more accurately, a man more fully formed into what he had always been becoming. Back in Czechoslovakia, he settled into working life with the unremarkable surface of a man going nowhere in particular. He took odd jobs. He cycled. He attended football matches, cheered for his team, talked to neighbors with just enough warmth to avoid scrutiny. To anyone watching, Václav Mrazek was a quiet, slightly odd, ultimately harmless young man. The kind that every village has, the kind that blends into the background of ordinary life without friction. But the interior of that ordinary-looking man was a different landscape entirely. Mrazek had begun to develop an obsession that he himself could barely articulate, a compulsion that grew heavier and more insistent with each passing year, until by the early 1950s it had become something he could no longer contain. He was drawn to women in the forests and on the back roads, not with romance, not with connection, with something colder and more predatory. The particular hunger of a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that other people existed primarily for his use. He acquired a weapon, a Walther PP 7.65mm caliber, compact, reliable, the kind of firearm that fit inside a jacket pocket without creating so much as a visible outline. He kept it hidden. He maintained it carefully. And in the summer of 1951, with that pistol in his pocket and 6 years of mounting compulsion pressing against the inside of his chest, Václav Mrazek walked into the forests outside Drahanis. He would not walk out of them the same man. What happened on the 22nd of August 1951, near Drahanis, was the moment the forest wraith was truly born. The day the quiet cycling enthusiast, the shy football fan, the overlooked man of no consequence, crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. 15-year-old Hanna Klebova was in the forest that day doing what many rural young people did in that era, tending to cows, grazing them in the cool shade of the trees. It was an ordinary task on an ordinary day in an ordinary summer. She had no reason to be afraid. There was nothing in the landscape that day to suggest the world was about to end for her. Mrazek found her there. He was carrying a stick. What followed was not the quick, detached act of a man following some calculated script. It was savage. He beat her to death, not with the clean efficiency of a weapon designed to kill, but with the repetitive, bone-crushing force of a stick swung again and again and again until the girl stopped moving. There was nothing clinical about it. It was intimate in the worst possible sense, close, physical, personal. When she was dead, he dragged her body away from the grazing cows, deeper into the concealing dark of the forest. And then he did something that would define every murder that followed. Something that investigators, when they eventually uncovered the full truth, would describe in their reports with a horror barely contained beneath professional language. He violated her body. He left her there, in the quiet of the trees, and walked back out into the afternoon light as though nothing of consequence had occurred. This murder, the killing of Hanna Klebova, would not be connected to Mrazek's wider crime spree until years later, when he himself confessed to it. At the time, it was an isolated, unsolved tragedy in a countryside still learning how to function under a communist government more interested in hunting political enemies than solving crimes against ordinary people. And so Václav Mrazek remained free, untouched, unremarked upon, a man cycling the roads of northern Bohemia with a pistol in his pocket and a darkness in his heart that the sunlight never quite reached. He had tasted it now, and he had not been caught. The forest had kept his secret. It would keep it for a very long time. Less than a month after the murder of Hanna Klebova, Václav Mrazek killed again. September 16, 1951. A road stretching between the towns of Jerkov and Kajis, a route unremarkable enough to walk 100 times without incident. Bronislava Padjakova was 32 years old. She was simply on a road. That was her entire crime in the eyes of the man who came upon her. She existed in a space he had chosen, and she was a woman, and that was enough. Mrazek raised his pistol and fired 3 times. 3 shots. The sound cracked through the countryside, sharp and final, scattering birds from the surrounding trees. Bronislava fell. He dragged her body across the landscape. Not a quick or easy task, a woman's full weight resisting every step, until he reached the stream nearby. There, he violated her. And then, as methodically as a man disposing of evidence rather than erasing a life, he pushed her into the water and let the current carry her away. But those 3 gunshots bothered him. The noise, the way it had ripped through the air and announced itself to anyone within range. Mrazek was not a man who enjoyed risk in the conventional sense. His particular compulsion existed in secrecy, in silence, in the space between discovery and suspicion. Loud gunfire was the opposite of that. So after Bronislava Padjakova's body was surrendered to the stream, Mrazek made a decision. He switched to a knife. This choice, this single strategic pivot, speaks volumes about the nature of the man. He was not operating in a frenzied, uncontrollable rage that erased rational thought. He was thinking, adapting, refining. The same organized, methodical mind that had made him a gifted thief in childhood was now being applied to murder with the same cold-eyed efficiency. He was not a man spiraling out of control. He was a man in disturbingly precise control of himself, of his methods, of the way he moved through the world, leaving almost nothing behind. He found 2 more women. He attacked both with the knife. Both survived. The first victim suffered a wound to the jaw, the blade punching through soft tissue and glancing off bone. Brutal, debilitating, but she lived. The second was stabbed 18 times. But Mrazek's instinct for concealment had, in a terrible irony, worked against him. He had committed himself to shallow wounds, not driving the blade deep enough to guarantee death, staying close to the surface of the body. The 18 stab wounds, numerous as they were not lethal. The woman survived, and those wounds, their number, their pattern, their particular shallowness, sent investigators in an entirely wrong direction, leading at least one detective to theorize that the attacker might have been a woman. The wounds looked tentative. They looked hesitant. They were not hesitant. Mrazek simply did not yet trust the knife the way he trusted the gun. He went back to the gun. On the 1st of June, 1952, 19-year-old Elena Murmanova was walking when Mrazek found her. He raised the Walther and fired 3 times. All 3 bullets struck her, and still, impossibly, she survived. She was wounded, shattered, traumatized, but she did not die. Mrazek left her, either believing she was beyond help or calculating that he needed to move quickly. But the day that followed, the 2nd of June, 1952, would produce one of the most disturbing details in this entire case. Elena Murmanova, recovering from her bullet wounds, would later tell investigators about the area near where she had been attacked. And in that same area, a discovery was made. The body of 16-year-old Marie Dvorokova. She had been in that stretch of landscape on the same day as Murmanova's shooting. She had not survived. 2 victims in the same location on the same day. One who lived, one who did not. The randomness of it, the proximity of survival and death separated only by circumstance, is one of those details that makes this case linger long after you have finished reading about it. Mrazek disappeared again. Not literally. He continued cycling his roads, attending his matches, going to work. He was not hiding. He was simply invisible, the way unremarkable men are always invisible, the way silence passes for innocence to eyes that are not yet looking closely enough. 2 years passed. July 14th, 1954. A forest path. 16-year-old Jarina Helmikova was walking through the trees when Mrazek came upon her from behind. He shot her. The sound of her body falling was absorbed by the forest, that perpetual accomplice, that landscape of dark trees and deep shadows that had sheltered him from the very beginning. He pulled her body away from the path, into the deeper cover of the undergrowth, and violated her. Then he left. He was 30 years old. He had killed 4 people. He had attacked others who survived. He had never been questioned, never been approached, never been placed in the same sentence as the word suspect. In all the investigations that stirred briefly around each murder before settling back into the exhausted silence of an under-resourced police force, Václav Mrazek's name had never once appeared. He was a ghost. He was the wraith the forest kept producing and then swallowing again. But 1955 brought a moment that came terrifyingly close to costing 2 lives, and instead cost 2. August 9th, 1955. A road between Komutov and Brezhnev. Evening light fading across the countryside. 2 young people walking together, 19-year-old Lyubia Duvkova and 26-year-old Kirill Chlifich. A couple simply out together in the summer evening, the kind of scene repeated across every small town in every country in the world. A scene of ordinary human warmth and companionship. Mrazek stepped onto the road. He produced the Walther. He shot Kirill Chlifich 3 times. Chlifich fell. Mrazek stripped his body of everything valuable. Money, possessions, anything of worth, and dragged the body to a nearby ditch where he covered it with branches and vegetation. A man reduced to a hidden parcel in a ditch, covered with sticks, erased from the surface of the world in minutes. Lyubia Duvkova had also been fired at during the initial burst of violence. She had been hit, but she had not lost consciousness. And in the chaos and terror of that moment, her companion shot the gunman moving. She made a decision that showed extraordinary presence of mind. She played dead. She lay utterly still. She controlled her breathing. She listened to the sounds of Mrazek moving nearby, the dragging of Chlifich's body, the rustle of branches being layered over the ditch. She waited, and when the sounds suggested he had moved away, when she calculated that he had gone far enough, she rose. And she ran. Mrazek saw her. He raised the Walther again. He fired. The bullet struck her in the back. Lyubia Duvkova fell for the last time. He dragged her body to a nearby field, and there he repeated what he had done to every woman he killed. Following this double murder, the authorities of Komutov were under undeniable pressure. 2 bodies in one location. Couple. A young woman who had tried to survive. The public demanded answers. Investigators brought in resources they had not previously deployed. For the first time in Czechoslovak history, A special dedicated task force was established solely to identify and capture the killer stalking the roads and forests of the Komyatov region. And still they could not find him. The task force, for all its historical novelty, was hamstrung by the same structural failures that had plagued Czechoslovak law enforcement since the communist government had swept away its experienced pre-war investigators and replaced them with politically reliable young men whose loyalty exceeded their skill. These were not detectives in any meaningful professional sense. They were ideologically vetted employees of a system that valued obedience over expertise. They were hunting a ghost with hands that had never caught anything. Mrazek, meanwhile, had expanded his crimes. While the murders were the darkest expression of his pathology, they existed alongside a sprawling ecosystem of lesser violations: burglaries, break-ins, thefts of every description. He stole linen. He stole pets. He stole bicycles. He stole with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to everything else. His apartment, investigators would eventually discover, was a museum of stolen goods, shelf upon shelf, drawer upon drawer, stacked with objects taken from dozens of victims across years of relentless, compulsive theft. And when the stealing was not enough, when the darkness pressed too hard and the forest roads beckoned, he hunted. The wraith was far from finished. There are crimes that are difficult to absorb all at once. Cases where the full weight of what one person has done to others can only be processed in stages, because the mind instinctively resists the complete picture. The case of Václav Mrazek is one of those. Each individual act is disturbing enough in isolation. Together, laid out in sequence, they form something that presses against the limits of what the word disturbing can carry. By the mid-1950s, Mrazek had killed multiple times and escaped detection completely. But the murders were only one layer of what he was doing. Running beneath them, quieter, less visible to investigators but devastating in its own right, was a pattern of sexual violence against victims far younger than his murder targets. Victims he chose not to kill, he later told investigators, because he calculated it was unnecessary, because killing them would bring greater scrutiny, because in his organized, methodical assessment of risk, leaving certain victims alive was the more strategic choice. He was not wrong. It had worked. The youngest of these victims was 6 years old. 6 years old. This detail, buried in the documentary record of his trial, is one of those facts that strips away any remaining ambiguity about the nature of the man. He was not someone who had crossed a line in a moment of broken judgment. He was not someone operating in a temporary altered state that erased his understanding of what he was doing. He was, as investigators and the court later confirmed, entirely mentally conscious of the harm his actions caused. He understood. He chose. He proceeded. November 9th, 1956. This date marks the final murder in Mrazek's documented crime spree, and it carries with it a particular horror that distinguishes it even from the others. Elżbieta Baron was a woman living her life in the region that Mrazek had turned into his private hunting ground. He entered her home during a burglary, a break-in that began as theft and escalated into something far worse. He killed her with an axe, not a gunshot from a distance, not a knife used on a forest road. An axe inside her home, in the space that should have been her refuge from the world outside. The violence of this death was of a different texture than the shootings on the roads. Those carried a certain predatory distance. The crack of a pistol, the fall of a body in open air, the perpetrator already moving before the dust settled. This was interior, close, the sound of it contained by walls, the particularity of someone being murdered in a domestic space, amid the objects of ordinary life, furniture, belongings, the accumulated material of a daily existence, gives this killing an almost unbearable intimacy of horror. But Mrazek was not done. Also in that house was Elżbieta Baron's 11-year-old daughter, Jarmila. He did not kill her. In the terrible mathematics of his reasoning, the same calculation that had led him to spare other young victims, killing Jarmila presented too much risk. A murdered child inside a burglarized home, on top of a murdered woman, would bring every investigative resource the country possessed down on that area with a ferocity that might finally reach him. So he violated her instead, and left her alive. Jarmila Baron survived. And the trauma she carried out of that house on November 9, 1956, is the kind that does not end when the event ends. It is the kind that rewrites the architecture of a person's interior world so fundamentally that nothing that comes after is ever quite the same. Mrazek walked out of that house into the November evening. He went home. A hair clipper from the Barron household went with him. That detail, that specific, ordinary object, a hair clipper taken from the home of a woman he had just axed to death, would eventually become the thread that unraveled everything. But in November 1956, it was simply one more stolen item added to the collection filling his apartment, one more piece of someone else's life absorbed into his own. The investigation that followed the Barron murder was, by any standard, inadequate to the crime. Investigators in the Komyatov region had been trying to identify the killer they had been tracking since 1951. They had a body of evidence suggesting a single perpetrator. The distinctive patterns left at each scene, the particular nature of the postmortem violations, the combination of robbery and murder that formed a consistent signature across half a decade of attacks. They had, by this point, established the Special Task Force. They had resources they had not previously deployed. And still, nothing. The killer remained a name they did not have, a face they could not describe, a man who moved through their net like smoke through a screen door. What made this failure so structurally revealing was that it was not simply a matter of insufficient effort. The investigators trying to catch Mrazek were, in large part, victims of the political environment in which they operated. Post-war Czechoslovakia, under communist governance, had systematically dismantled its experienced pre-war detective corps. Men with years of investigative experience, men who had solved murders before, who understood forensic methodology, who had developed the instincts that only come from sustained engagement with criminal cases, had been removed from their positions between 1948 and 1950. Their replacements were politically reliable. They were from the working class. They were enthusiastic servants of the new ideological order. They were not, in any meaningful sense, detectives. The system had optimized for loyalty and produced incompetence. And the people of Komyatov paid for that optimization in blood. Mrazek, for his part, seemed almost to sense the safety that this structural failure provided him. He continued his patterns without significant modification. He continued to cycle the same roads. He continued to work his jobs, and it was his employment that would eventually deliver him, but not yet. Not in 1956. In 1956, he was still moving freely, still invisible, still the shy man at the football match who nobody looked at twice. But there was a change happening beneath the surface of events in early 1957, a slow tightening of circumstances that neither Mrazek nor anyone else quite recognized for what it was. The investigation, after the Barron murder, had intensified in ways that were small but cumulative. Officers were cross-referencing thefts with the murder sites. Someone had noted the pattern of stolen goods appearing at crime scenes. Someone else had begun looking more carefully at the specific nature of items taken, not just their monetary value, but their character. The hair clipper from the Barron household was logged, noted, placed in a file. The file grew thick. Meanwhile, Mrazek had changed jobs again. He was working at the Nejedly colliery near Libusin. A miner had injured his hand and left his work clothes in the locker room. And one day, one ordinary, unremarkable day in early 1957, that miner returned unexpectedly and found Vaslav Mrazek standing at his locker with his hands inside the pockets of his clothes. It was not the discovery of a murderer. It was the discovery of a pickpocket. A thief caught in the act of a minor crime so petty it barely warranted a formal report. But the report was filed. Because there had been numerous similar thefts at that facility, and because the police were now documenting patterns, the report connected to others. Mrazek's name moved from obscurity into the margin of investigation. His address was noted, and on March 17, 1957, police arrived at his home for what was, on paper, a routine inspection related to workplace theft. What they found inside that apartment stopped them cold. The objects were everywhere, on shelves, in drawers, stacked in corners. Items of every description, clothing, tools, personal effects, none of them belonging to the man who lived there. It was a lifetime of theft made material, a hoarder's paradise of other people's possessions. Officers moved through the rooms with the slow, methodical thoroughness of people who understood that what they were looking at was not ordinary. In the cellar, behind a table with a hollow leg, they found the Walther PP. And the bullets in that weapon, tested against the ballistic records accumulated across years of murder investigations in the Komyatov region, matched. They matched the shots that had killed Bronislava Padjakova. They matched the shots that had killed Jarina Helmikova. They matched the shots that had torn into the bodies of Karel Tlyfage and Lyubustuvkova on that road between Komyatov and Brezhnev on a summer evening in 1955. The forest wraith had a name. The forest wraith had an address. And the forest wraith, confronted with the ballistic evidence in a police interrogation room, had finally run out of forest. Václav Mrazek did not confess immediately. That is important to understand, because it speaks to the particular character of the man, the controlled, deliberate, calculating individual who had evaded capture for 6 years not through luck alone, but through the consistent exercise of a cold and organized mind. Even in the interrogation room, even with the Walther PP on the table between him and the detectives who had finally found him, Mrazek held. He maintained the silence of a man who understood that evidence required proof beyond the object itself. But then the ballistic report arrived. Full, detailed, unambiguous. Every bullet matched. Every slug pulled from every body and every survivor over 6 years of murders pointed back to the same weapon. The weapon that had been sitting in the hollow leg of a table in his cellar, waiting for exactly this moment. The investigators who brought the report into the interrogation room later recalled what happened next with a kind of quiet disbelief. Václav Mrazek, the man who had killed 7 people and violated their bodies, the man who had attacked children and left a trail of devastation across a decade of criminal activity, broke down crying. Not screaming, not raging, not collapsing into the theatrical performance of a guilty man trying to elicit sympathy. He simply wept, quietly, like someone who has been carrying something impossibly heavy for an impossibly long time and has finally been relieved of the weight, regardless of the cost of relief. And then he talked. He talked at length. He confessed to all 7 murders in detail, with a specificity that confirmed the authenticity of his account beyond any reasonable doubt. He described each killing, the locations, the methods, the particular circumstances that had brought him to each victim. He confessed to the murder of Hanna Klebova in 1951, the killing that had never been connected to him, the 15-year-old girl in the forest outside Drohanis, whose death had sat in an unsolved file for 6 years because no one knew whose hand had held that stick. He confessed to the rapes, all 14 of the documented sexual assaults for which he was ultimately charged, and others beyond those. A catalog of violation that investigators noted with the grim, careful professionalism of people who had seen terrible things and were determined to document each one with the gravity it deserved. He confessed to the burglaries, 33 of them, the linen thefts, the pet thefts, the bicycles, the petty stealing that had run beneath the murders like a second, quieter river of criminality, sustaining him financially while the darker compulsions sustained something else in him entirely. The file that his case generated ultimately ran to 16 volumes. 16 volumes. In the course of the investigation and trial preparation, one curious element emerged from Mrazek's own statements about himself. He claimed, with apparent sincerity, that he hated the sight of blood. He who had beaten a teenager to death with a stick. He who had shot multiple people at close range. He who had used a knife on victims in the forests between his shootings. He hated the sight of blood. The investigators noted this without extensive commentary. The psychiatrists who examined him reached the conclusion that Mrazek was mentally conscious of the harm his actions caused, that there was no defense of diminished awareness, no claim that could be made for a man who did not understand what he was doing. He understood completely. He had always understood the organized, methodical nature of his crimes. The switching from gun to knife and back to gun based on noise concerns, the deliberate concealment of bodies, the years of successful evasion, was not compatible with a mind that did not comprehend its own actions. He was, in the forensic and legal sense of the era, fully responsible. There was also a moment during the investigation when Mrazek became entangled in another unsolved case. 3 murders in North Bohemia in 1951. referred to in police files as Operation Erica, named after one of the victims, bore enough similarity to his known crimes that investigators considered him a serious suspect. Mrazek denied these killings. He was eventually cleared of 2 of the 3, though the process of elimination took considerable time. It is a measure of the breadth of his documented crimes that additional murders were being attributed to him and requiring disproof. The trial of Václav Mrazek moved with a speed that reflected the era's judicial approach to cases of this severity. The communist state was not known for extended legal deliberation when guilt was established and political will aligned with a swift outcome. Mrazek was convicted of 7 murders, for attempted murders and 14 rapes, along with the avalanche of subsidiary charges that the 127 crime total represented. The conviction was delivered. The sentence was announced. Mrazek was reportedly surprised, not by the conviction. He had confessed, after all, and understood that the evidence was inescapable. He was surprised by the severity. He had believed, through some miscalculation whose origins remain unclear, that the death penalty was not available for his crimes. He had apparently calculated, in the same quiet, methodical way he calculated everything, that the maximum sentence he would face was 10 years in prison. 10 years. For 7 murders. For the beating death of a 15-year-old girl. For the shooting of a couple on a summer road. For the axe murder of a woman in her home and the violation of her 11-year-old daughter. For the bodies in ditches and streams and secluded forest clearings that had accumulated across 6 years of predation. 10 years. The sentence handed down was not 10 years. It was death. Václav Mrazek was to be executed by hanging at Pankrak prison in Prague, a facility that had, in the preceding decades, witnessed executions under Nazi occupation and communist governance both, a place whose walls had absorbed enough human tragedy to constitute a kind of architecture of sorrow. He was held there as the date of execution approached. There is no documented account of how he spent those final weeks. Whether he continued to reflect on his crimes with the quiet lucidity he had shown in confession, or whether the approaching end produced something different in him. He had wept when the ballistic evidence confirmed his guilt. He had spoken with apparent consciousness of the harm he had caused. Whether that consciousness produced anything resembling genuine remorse, or whether it was simply the acknowledgement of an organized mind that the game was concluded, is a question that the historical record does not clearly answer. December 29, 1957. That is the date most frequently cited for the execution of Václav Mrazek, though some sources place it on the 30th. A discrepancy of a single day that changes nothing of substance about what happened inside Pankrak prison on that cold December night. The rope was prepared. The procedure was followed. The forest wraith, age 32, was hanged. His death closed the documented chapter. But cases like his rarely close cleanly, they leave edges, unanswered questions, the whisper of other crimes that may never be fully accounted for. There were other bodies in other locations in those years that bore the fingerprints of his method, the particular combination of sexual violation, robbery, and disposal in remote areas that had come to define his signature. Some of these remained unresolved. Some were officially attributed to him. Others were not due to insufficient evidence. The 16 volumes of his case file contained what could be proven, what could only be suspected lives in the margin. The victims whose names are confirmed: Hanna Klebova, Bronislava Padjarkova, Marie Dvorokova, Jarina Helmikova, Karel Trelifich, Libius Dufkova, Elzbieta Baron, and the survivors Elena Murmanova, shot 3 times and alive. Jarmila Baron, 11 years old, left to carry what was done to her in her mother's home for the rest of her life. The unnamed young women stabbed on forest roads. The children whose ages in the police reports produce a specific, nauseating kind of horror. These were the people that the post-war Czechoslovak state's inability to competently investigate murder had allowed Václav Mrazek 6 years to accumulate. 6 years of victims, 6 years of continued freedom, while the families of the dead attended funerals and waited for answers that were not coming. 6 years during which a man with a Walther PP in his jacket pocket cycled the roads of northern Bohemia and was invisible to every official who might have stopped him. History would eventually describe him as the most prolific serial killer in the Czech Republic after World War II. That distinction carries a specific weight when you consider the context. A country that had just survived Nazi occupation, that was actively processing the losses of that occupation while building a new political order, that was doing all of this with a law enforcement apparatus that had been deliberately hollowed of its most experienced members for ideological reasons. Into that gap Václav Mrazek had walked, and moved through it for 6 years like a shadow. He was quiet. He was ordinary. He was patient. He was methodical. And he was everywhere the investigation was not. The Forest kept his secret for 6 years, 3 months, and 18 days. In the end, it was not brilliant police work that caught him. It was a hair clipper and a hollow table leg. The mundane residue of a lesser crime, sitting in a locker room where the wrong person reached into the wrong pocket at the wrong moment. Crime, in all its darkness and complexity, is sometimes brought to its end not by the dramatic machinery of justice, but by the smallest, most ordinary accident of circumstance. The forest wraith is gone. The forests of northern Bohemia are quiet now. But the names of his victims deserve to be spoken. Clearly, soberly, and with the full weight of what was taken from each of them. They were not just victims of one man. They were victims of a system that failed them. And they deserved so much better than the silence that surrounded their deaths for so many years. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.